Yidora still felt like she had been transported to another world. Since she had been taken from the surface and brought to the Antares, she had been through meeting after meeting, brief after brief, so much so that she felt like her head was spinning constantly. She had amassed a small army of personnel, humans mostly, but the one thing she didn't know how to say was what she was going to be saying today. It was terrifying, in more than one way. Her people, the 20 million planetside, were indeed looking to her to lead. She had thought it was a strange thing. In fact, she thought it was insane. Why her, when she was just as they were, no different? A few of the older members of her species, who even now sat around her, had told her a bit, but it wasn't enough to dispel the insanity of her situation for her. The Kellandro line, an unbroken line of nobility that had stretched back to the time of what the elders called the first cities, had ruled from before time was recorded. The Shesvie were not the Shesvie without the Kellandro. In some ways it made her head spin, because even she knew about how important the Kellandro were to her people. She just never imagined that she was one of them. In fact, one of the last of them, unless another was found. It made sense in a way, the way her people looked to her now, expectations gleaming in their yellow eyes, their beaks held high, stiff neck muscles tense. In other ways, it horrified her. She was not qualified to do this. She was not bred to do this. She was a cheap figurehead, and that's all she felt like right now. Today it would be proven. She would come to the leader of this armada, say what she had to say, and then hope for mercy. She had learned that her people had tried to secret her family, the bulk of them, into Chiwa space. Indeed, that's how the humans had found her and known who she was and what she was, because from what records still persisted, the Kellandro family had attempted to flee when the fleet battle at the Tirana Lane had been lost so decisively. The humans had been looking for her or someone like her the moment that they had first started securing Shesvie from captivity. After the first human had come for her, they had brought her directly to this floating behemoth named Antares, and for the week and some days after, her entire world had flipped on its head. The humans were patient, but she could tell there was something they'd much rather be doing. She knew what that something was, too. They had been at war with the Vral for decades of their solar years, and they were finally on the offensive. Something about the humans and the Chua who were with them terrified her, and she didn't know how to quantify this fear. One of the elders had made it a little clear for her. The fellow matriarch had told her that it was the unknown. When the oversea? No, even internally she had to force herself not to think of them as that. When the Vral had been over her, she knew exactly where she stood. She knew if she stepped out of line what exactly would happen. She knew that the Vral would torment her for entertainment if she caught their eye. The humans, though, what would they do? Today she would find out. As the announcement system on Antares began to chime for readiness to enter hyperspace lane, she had stopped the briefing she was in the middle of. They had been appraising her on the amount of skilled laborers her people had, pitifully few. How much of her culture was simply gone? How much had been just erased? What made the Shesvie the Shesvie? She didn't know. There was no way to know, and that was the tragedy of the entire situation. Her species had held 20 systems, 15 of them populated. They had universities, they had culture, they had music and art. Where was it now? Armed humans walked beside her to her left and right. If someone stepped in front of her procession, they loudly called to make a hole or make way. She did her best to look dignified, but didn't know if she was doing the part. They had tried to give her clothes to match what her people had once worn, but it just felt odd after spending so long wearing nothing but rags, if anything. One of the first things she learned the Vral had stripped them of was their basic identity, which had been corrected from humanity by a sheepish-looking woman. She didn't know what to say to that. She didn't know what to say when someone used their own species name as a marker for what made one who they were. The Chiwa had been asked for a synonym, but they simply didn't have a word for that, which she had come to know was a common thing for the pragmatic species. Yidora was nervous, more nervous than she had been in a long time. It was only getting worse the more they walked. She was used to the steel slab of the floor of her home, walking barefoot, feeling dirt between her toes. The padded and rubberized grips of her foot coverings now felt abjectly alien to her. Her feathers, for so long deprived of even the most basic care besides what she could do, had been cleaned and shined. She felt utterly foolish, an imposter of a ruler. As she stepped onto the massive bridge wing of this warship, she turned her head left, then right. Around her was her staff, 2 elders of her species, a dozen humans, and a Chua who brought up the rear. Ahead of her on the command dais was the human known as Simmons. She was shorter than Yidora had expected, with a well-kept gray mane of hair pulled tightly back. Some said that gray on a human head was a mark of age, but this human did not look old, not in the slightest. Yidora had gotten the feeling in the only other time she had met Simmons that she let her hair be gray simply to remind everyone that she was not young. Perplexing, but many things about the humans perplexed her. She tried not to look away as Simmons saw her. She knew very little about humans, but she saw that the woman was fierce, and right now she looked like a storm of activity. She was triumphant, zealous. Something was happening that Yidora didn't know about, she was sure of it. Simmons's expression suddenly became starkly more friendly, less predatory as she saw Yidora. "Yidora Kellandro, Grand Matriarch," Simmons called out, even as her steps failed her. This was it. She felt a clump of dread form in her gizzard, her stones there fresh, but she felt her glands rubbing the rocks together. Simmons strode down the stairs, separating them, stopping a few feet away. "I'm sorry I haven't come down sooner. It's a busy thing running a fleet, although that's no excuse." She crossed her hands behind her back. "I do apologize if I seem a bit rushed. We're about to start a major operation, which of course you are welcome to observe. We do not wish to join the Terran front." Yidora felt her beak part, felt the words tumble out of her, heard her human staff take in a breath, felt her heart's hammering against her rib cage. It took every ounce of willpower to keep her eyes on Simmons' eyes. She waited for the anger, waited for the expression to turn. "I see," Simmons said, and Yidora could tell that she was off-footed. Simmons's eyebrows both raised, and she looked off to the floor by Yidora's feet. She was holding her breath, and knew it. "Well, I won't say I'm not disappointed, but it's something we thought might be a possibility." "Very well, then." Yidora kept her breath in her chest, feeling her feathers begin to bristle. Simmons brought her arms forward and settled them on her hips, still looking off to the side. "Well, okay then, that answers that question." The human smiled at her, and Yidora felt herself exhale. The human was smiling? "Well, you'll be pleased in any regard to know we are about to start the invasion of your people's space to take it back." Yidora suddenly felt low, like she had done something wrong. She was silent for a few long seconds, and she felt her 2 Shesvie elders coming to her side. The next question she had was burning in her head, but she didn't know how to phrase it. Simmons looked off to the side as a uniformed man approached her and held up a hand, the gesture stopping him. She finally formed the question, remaining unmoving in her place. "May I ask what will become of us?" Simmons' eyes raised back to hers, and the human motioned to the dais, then began walking. Yidora hesitated a moment, then followed along behind her. As Simmons reached the table, she could understand nothing she was seeing. She had only seen a few star charts and hyperspace lanes over the last few days, and they were still alien to her. The markers next to those charts also meant nothing. "Okay, so," Simmons said, giving herself a moment to compose her thoughts, finally pointing at a point on a lane map. "This is us, and this," she motioned to the next star in line, "is the first system that we know to be populated." Simmons tapped on the star, bringing up a rudimentary display for the planets in the system. "The 2nd and 3rd planets here. We know that before the Vral invaded your homes, they were inhabited. This one in particular, the 3rd one, is the one we're going after first. I'm taking the Antares in, alongside a good portion of the fleet. We are actually waiting for the scout of that system now." Simmons motioned to Yidora, then back to the display. "Our intention is to take back those planets, and the offer is on the table to move your people from here to there, back into your home systems." "What happens then?" Yidora asked, her clothes itching her. "What happens when you move us back to us? What will you do with us?" "Do?" Simmons asked, raising an eyebrow. Then suddenly her face softened. "Oh." She blinked once, then shook her head once. "Oh, okay, I'm sorry. I understand now." "I apologize, but are we to be your neighbors?" Simmons said, then gave her a small smile. You will be our neighbors. Don't get me wrong, there has been some talk about what to do when we found your people. There was talk about simply rolling your people into the fold, she said, turning to the panel beside her and tapping as she continued talking. The Chewa convinced us otherwise. You'll find they have a habit of that. So what we came up with was this. She finished tapping as a document appeared on the screen. What is this? Yidora asked, not quite willing or indeed able to tell Simmons that her ability to read was rudimentary at best. An outline. To be honest, we don't know what state these worlds are going to be in. We don't know even now the state of your people. Considering your wishes, some of this is going to be cancelled out. But for the most part, we intend to move your people off of that rock back to one that you historically owned. From there, our level of assistance is going to be up to you, Simmons said, tapping her hand on the panel, then looking back to Yidora. If you want us to just leave, we'll just leave. Yidora pulled her head back in surprise. Our goal, though, is to get your people back on your feet regardless. We've been finding out your needs. Right now, we're looking to meet them. We have no intention of just abandoning you. We have no intention of forcing your people into anything. Yidora stared at Simmons, not quite believing what she was saying. So if I told you that we just wanted to be left alone, you would just go? No questions asked? Exactly, but we'd prefer not to. Your people are going to need, well, everything. Simmons motioned to her. It's not really my area of expertise, but from what I'm told, you're going to need doctors, teachers, engineers, all of it, until you are back to being self-sufficient. The only thing that we're going to ask for, as far as I've learned, is to establish a few resupply ports for the duration of this war. Yidora was silent a few long moments, then her head lowered almost imperceptibly. I do not believe that we will ask you to leave immediately, if that is acceptable. Simmons nodded. Then she turned back to the panel, bringing up the map of the hyperlanes connected to their system. Yidora looked down at the map, still not understanding most of what she was seeing, but Simmons was watching her again. Simmons was looking down at the screen, a small smile on her face, but it wasn't friendly. Yidora felt a chill run through her spine and clench against her hearts. She took a small step towards the table. What of the humans on our world? Yidora asked. I know the Vral were hard on them, especially recently. Simmons's mouth tightened into a fine line, and Yidora watched her nose wrinkle, then twitch. Human faces were so intensely expressive. They are being cared for. They will be returned to Earth. The world they are from is a blasted rock now, so we will take them back to the homeworld. We're going to see what we can do for them, Simmons said, her voice flat. And for a moment, Yidora could see a distance in her eyes. Questions. Yidora wanted to ask questions, but it did not seem appropriate in the slightest. Yidora looked back to the screen, but a sudden shift in the mood got her attention. It was almost a smell coming off of the fleet marshal, and Yidora looked back to the woman only to be alarmed at the intense stare, her furrowed brows, the way her entire face had shifted. Yidora decided at that moment that she never wanted to be the subject of that stare, when the very subject of that stare spoke. Grand Matriarch Fleet Marshal, came a trilling voice, cool and melodious, and Yidora looked to her right to see a smaller, long-necked avian. Its feathers were stark white, its beak long and curved. Forgive me for intruding, but I couldn't help. Ambassador Tika, is there something we can do for you? Simmons almost growled, so much so that Yidora's feathers bristled and her heavily muscled shoulders tensed. The one she called Tika bowed its head, doing a small motion with its feet. Yidora knew it to be some sort of display, but had no idea what it could possibly signify. Behind the one Tika had addressed stood another 3 of the avians, similar in appearance to Tika, but smaller, the feathers covering them soft blues and yellows. Tika, long neck curving, was holding a datapad. For some reason, Yidora could tell that he was a male just by the way he positioned himself. Yidora hoped she wasn't wrong about that. Yes. Well, you see, I heard that you have found the Shesvie, Tika began, and Simmons's head came up, his sentence cutting off before it had even fully formed. If looks could kill, Tika would have been a red mist. There was a history here, and Yidora didn't know what that history was, but it was far from good. Well, I wanted to... Tika's body seemed to arch, his wings curling up behind him, his neck curling into an S shape, and Yidora took a small step back. Tika and Yidora were biologically as different as Tika was from Simmons on a practical level. Yidora was broad-shouldered, as broad as a larger human male. Tika's shoulders were narrow and tight with her body. Yidora's beak was stout and broad, her neck thick and stiff. Tika's was long and narrow. Yidora's feathers were narrow, almost resembling thick fur. Tika's were broad, as if she could take to the skies. Still, Yidora saw what Tika was doing, how they were behaving, and it reminded her so much of a display of embarrassment she actually felt sorry for the smaller avian. "Well, I wanted to provide the Grand Matriarch with this." Tika's feet slowly pranced up and down, even as his hand came forward, offering the datapad. The avians behind him lowered their heads, a female by the look of it, turning their beaks away from Tika's display. Yidora took the datapad, not seeing anything displayed on its surface. "Thank you." After a few moments of glancing to the avian and glancing back to the datapad, she spoke again. "What is this?" "Ah, yes, well, we shared a border with your people and there was a fair amount of cultural exchange, so I compiled as much as I could get in my roost," Tika said, coming out of the stance and straightening. Yidora glanced at Simmons, who had an eyebrow raised. "This is the cultural index that was shared with us by your people. I am glad to say the file is rather large." Tika was properly preening right now. "I believe there is a good amount of literature, religious text, copies of art, architecture, so much interesting information that I positively filled the thing as much as I could find." Tika spread his wings and bowed low, the others of his species behind him following suit. "I do hope this is of interest to you." Yidora looked down at the datapad, her body feeling stiff, rigid. She felt a hand on her shoulder, a gentle one, then looked to the side to Simmons, who wore a small smile. Yidora looked back to Tika, who bowed again, flicking his wings hard and lowering his beak almost to the ground. "This is my people," Yidora whispered, holding the fairly new datapad like a cherished artifact. "Do you need this back?" "Not at all. In fact, I can make copies if you would like. I have it all stored on my terminal. I may be able to find more if you would like." Tika slowly raised from his graceful bow. "I would like that," Yidora whispered, then looked to Simmons, who gently rubbed her shoulder. Yidora knew nothing of her people besides the legends of the elders, most of whom never saw or experienced the life and sights that they spoke of. Wistful words of what once was, whispered to avoid the overseer's attention, spoken by bent-back ancients who yearned for a life that they had never experienced, to ears that regarded the stories as long-dead legends. She now held those legends in her hand, stored on a plastic composite datapad. "If you will excuse me." "Of course. We are about to begin our operation. Feel free to visit the bridge any time, Grand Matriarch." Simmons' voice was low, gentle. Yidora couldn't take her eyes off the datapad. She reached out her hand subconsciously, one of her Shesvie escorts rushing forward to take it and guide her. Her mind was awash. In her hands she held the story of her people. This would be opened, analyzed, studied. Her spine straightened, her neck still bent towards the unpowered datapad. Her people had an identity, and it was here. Simmons watched as the Shesvie matriarch walked, a slow procession out of the bridge. Tika stood a few feet away from her, his wings tucked close to his side. Simmons waited until the burly avian was out of earshot, the door closing behind her before she spoke again. "Are you going to tell her about the slaves your people hold, or will I?" Simmons's voice was cool, but it was missing the razor edge of spite that it normally held. "I will," Tika said, and Simmons raised her brow. Tika was faced towards the door, his wings drooping down, his feathers seeming to deflate for a few moments. "Xia," he trilled, and one of the Tyrannica, coated with soft blue feathers, stepped forward. "It is time." Simmons's hands slid onto her hips, watching as the second Tyrannica pulled a small recorder and walked slowly, pointing the recorder at both Simmons and Tika. Simmons looked between the two. The one Tika had called Xia made a small trilling noise. Tika looked from Xia back to the wall. "Live," Xia said. Simmons did not even have time to process that statement before the Tyrannica ambassador turned, and his feathers flitted back to their normal luster. "Fleet Marshal Simmons." Tika's voice was suddenly strong, his body held rigid. "I must be the bearer of news I do not wish to speak of again." Simmons was silent a moment, her eyes darting over to Xia, then Hazard, who was working quickly at his console. He held his finger over his panel and looked to her earnestly. "You are being broadcast," Hazard mouthed to her. Then he pointed at the console in front of him, making a slashing motion in front of his throat. "Cut it?" he mouthed, pointing at the console once again. She didn't understand what was happening, but she held up her hand with her palm out. He nodded and leaned back. His supervising officer came to his side, leaning down as Hazard watched her intently. While normally the scowl that seemed par for the course when dealing with the ambassador would have been stapled to her face, right now she was acutely aware that many eyes were on her. Also, she was more than aware of the words that Tika was using. He had virtually crawled towards her the times prior. She stayed silent. Tika continued, "My people, the Turinica, have refused to stand down from their stance on the members of your species that have been taken unjustly by the Vral and sold to us, as well as the Chua that are held." Simmons leaned back just a bit, both eyebrows raised now. For the first time since she had met the ambassador, she didn't feel like at the very least making a snide remark. "Understood." Again, the language used kept her in check. "Fleet Marshal, I am not only Turinica, but I am also what is known as Taratanti within my people. We are the leaders. Our words are to be respected. Our opinions are meant to be kept in the highest regard. Our counsel is meant to be heard, heeded, and acted on. My name is long, as do my station, my life, and my deeds." He went silent for a few moments, assuming the stance that Simmons had seen him in so often over the past few days. His neck curved into the pronounced S shape, his entire body seeming to curl in on itself, his wings proffered up and bent like he was anticipating a blow. Simmons stood by watching, carefully keeping her expression neutral. A small group was gathering, and out of the corner of her eye she could see her officers setting up a perimeter around them. One of the armed guards of the bridge was standing by as well. The two Turinica behind Tika stood in locked positions, their heads slightly lowered, their eyes shut. "I regret to inform you, Fleet Marshal, that my words have been ignored, my opinions disregarded." Slowly Tika's neck straightened, as did his body. "My counsel dismissed. My name, my station, my life, and my deeds have all been discounted." Tika bristled his feathers, and even Simmons didn't need to guess what he was doing. He was puffing himself up, a display of prowess and pride. His chest and neck seemed to swell, and he spread his wings to their full wingspan. Suddenly his entire body went locked and rigid, his wings snapping up to reveal his full plumage. Even Simmons couldn't say he didn't appear noble at that moment. "I am Tzikikunazikiakakiatkata." Heads across the bridge snapped towards them if they weren't already looking, as the Turinica ambassador's biology made his voice thunderous. Simmons stood her ground, for even though his voice was booming, he was still in no way a physical threat to her. "I am the one who brokered the sale of your captured people, the Chua people, the Shesvie people, the Bilaxi people, the Dumat people, the Kolra people, and the Wellerox people. For this I am ashamed. For my government I am ashamed. For my people I am ashamed." Simmons' jaw clenched, keeping her face stone. Tika's eyes were wide as he boomed his voice, his feathers beginning to tremble. "The error of my decision has been made clear. I declare it." Tika's voice turned suddenly bitter, spiteful. "But in error there must be correction. There must be redress. This has been denied to me. I carry this stain on me, forced on me by those who have ignored my words, turned away from my opinion, and rejected my counsel." His entire body seemed to vibrate. Simmons clenched her jaw harder, and she glanced to Hazard on the verge of giving the order to cut the transmission. She suddenly was shocked to realize that she was concerned for the Turinica ambassador. "I reject this stain, and those who have forced it on me. I will not wear it anymore," Tika thundered, and the two Turinica behind him stepped forward. "I refuse." Suddenly the two Turinica behind Tika reached up, grasping handfuls of the broad and beautiful feathers along Tika's wings, and yanked. Simmons' face cracked and she half lunged forward, moving to shove the other two away. Tika's head twisted down, his eyes locked with hers. The pain in them was intense. "I refuse!" he bellowed, and she caught herself. The two Tyrannica continued to tear the feathers off of Tika's body, a slow cascade of feathers falling like snow. Xia suddenly made a loud, keening cry, and Simmons looked towards her as Tika bellowed again. Xia was still holding the recorder, but her grip was shaking violently, her neck thrashing from side to side. One of the Tyrannica stripping the plumage from Tika stopped and quickly moved to Xia, taking hold of the recorder and pointed it straight once more. Xia curled her wings around herself and lowered herself to the ground, making another long, keening scream. "Please take this," the Tyrannica who held the camera said, his voice shaky, looking to the humans watching. "I need to help him." His voice dripped with raw emotion. Tika's voice suddenly boomed again, his voice clouded with pain born physically and emotionally. Simmons glanced over, struggling to keep her composure, and nodded once to her navigator. The officer reached over, gingerly taking the recorder, and not knowing what to do, simply kept it in the direction it was pointed. A small screen showed Simmons and Tika, the Tyrannica ambassador, being stripped of his plumage, the feathers drifting to the ground as Tika roared his denial again. Xia's neck writhed, taking a step forward only to take a step back. Every so often she would make the same keening cry. The second Tyrannica joined the first, and Simmons watched in morbid fascination. Stories came to her head of monks setting themselves on fire, of samurai committing ritualistic suicide, of religious fanatics committing self-mutilation. She wanted to stop this, but she stayed her hand. A quick glance showed that all eyes on the bridge were watching. Skin was showing through small, fist-sized holes, dark blue skin showing through, the wings a patchwork now. Some of the feathers were falling now stained with violet blood. Tika continued to show himself on display, but there was rapidly becoming nothing majestic about his appearance now. The two Tyrannica continued to grab fistfuls of feathers, the plumage drifting to the floor. Tika gave one last booming roar that couldn't be translated, and the two Tyrannica who had been stripping his plumage both took one final handful, pulling hard. Stepping to either side of Tika, they held their fists up to either side of Tika's wings and let the feathers fall. Tika's once majestic plumage, even by Simmons' own opinion, was destroyed. The Tyrannica in front of her now was an ugly thing, the plumage ruined and in patches. Simmons could see the thin skin of Tika's ribcage thudding on the right side with his rapid heartbeat. Slowly Tika began to fold his wings down, and as he did, the avian who had taken the camera from the one known as Xia padded over to Simmons' navigator, taking care not to step in the shot. Tika laid down in the ruins of his feathers and curled his head around his body. Simmons herself realized her mouth was hanging open and closed it. She looked to her navigator, who was giving the recorder to the Tyrannica. The Tyrannica turned the recorder on Tika and slowly walked up towards the ambassador, who was on the ground violently shaking. There was a chime heard as he pressed a button on the recorder. Simmons heard Hazard's voice call out, "They've ceased transmission." Xia rushed to Tika's side and threw out her arms, hovering over him and covering him with her own plumage. Simmons took a step forward, then looked to the crew who was staring, many of them slack-jawed. "Show's over," she yelled. "Delay the op an hour and get medical up here." The crew responded almost immediately, if a bit drunkardly. As she reached Tika's side, she kneeled down. Xia's soft plumage was covering him so completely that she couldn't see him underneath. Xia's neck was held stiff and straight, curved over her arching wings surrounding him, as if she was a mother protecting her chicks. Simmons tried not to step on the long feathers on the floor, tried not to step on the plumes of down-like feathers, but it was so widespread it couldn't be helped. Xia's head snapped around at her, an angry hiss coming from her beak. Simmons didn't pull back. Xia's beak was inches from her face, and she could see the dark blue eyes staring at her, but where she thought she had heard anger, Simmons realized it must have been something else. Xia's eyes reflected abject sorrow. "Don't forget what he just did," Xia trilled. "Don't ever forget." "What did he just do?" Simmons whispered, looking down at the small gap in her plumage covering Tika, seeing Tika's ribs exposed underneath. "What in the hell did you all just do to him?" Xia's neck trembled back and forth, and she stretched her neck back over Tika's body under her wings. There was a sound underneath, a soft trill, and Xia slowly began to retract her wings, uncovering the brutalized form of Tika again. His wings had been nearly stripped bare. The only places he still had plumage were his neck and parts of his legs. The rest of his body was a savage patchwork. He lay in his own ruin, his eyes closing and opening slowly. As Xia pulled away, he started twitching, and Simmons sucked in a breath at his appearance. Even when she had begun the war, when Tika was laying there covered in his own excrement, he hadn't looked this pathetic. "Ambassador Tika, what did you just do?" she whispered. "They'll listen now," Tika softly intoned. "They cannot ignore this. They will not ignore this." Tika's body shook violently, and Simmons reached out a hand to place it on his curved back but pulled it back to her side. She just knelt there, watching him for a few long moments. Then he softly trilled again. "Give it to her." Tika motioned to Xia, then gestured with his head to Simmons. Xia was brooding nearby, but as soon as Tika spoke, she retrieved a datapad, offering it to Simmons. "I am no longer an ambassador, Fleet Marshal." Tika softly trilled out, and Simmons looked up as the bridge opened, several men and women running onto the bridge marked with medical green. She glanced at the datapad and was about to look back to Tika, but her attention snapped back to the pad itself. It had been auto-translated, but even she could read the watermark for sensitive documents. "What did you do?" Simmons whispered. "What the hell have you done?" "What decency demands," Tika whispered back. "What must be done to atone? They will not be able to hide it now, and they won't be able to brush it off." Tika began slowly trying to push himself up, but he couldn't rise. His body trembled too much. Simmons held up her hand, holding the medical team back a moment. "There will be unrest, but they will listen now. I have done all I can." Tika laid his head back down in his discarded feathers. "Fleet Marshal, I apologize, but I must request political asylum."